Hello everybody, and welcome to this video, which is kindly sponsored by Squarespace. So today I'm going to show you a little bit more detail about how you can manipulate the images in your gallery. So just quickly speedrunning through adding a new page on early British destroyers. Select a gallery that is, at least initially, to your preference. Get rid of those, upload some pictures. You can see here some early British destroyer pictures, but you can see they're currently all in the columns in the center of the page. I'm going to set it to full bleed, so it's full width. And then you've got various aspect ratios. Now, a lot of these photographs are very long and thin. So by setting the aspect ratio to 16:9, you get a better view of most of the ships. But as you can see, some of them are still a little bit cut off. You can choose an even wider view. Now, that does help, but I personally think it cuts off the top and bottom of some other images. So I'm going to go with 16:9. And of course, as you see, you can have 2 columns, 1 column, 3 columns. I'm going to stick with 3 columns in this particular case, and I'm going to leave captions on so I can add captions later. I don't like that divider, so I'm just going to take it off, thus giving us our final format. But you'll be relieved to know that even with the images that look like they're a little bit cut off, if you open them, you can actually see the full picture. Then just add a link and you're done. So if after all these little mini tutorials I've been doing, you think you could build a website for maybe ideally naval history purposes, but you never know, you might want to do it for some other reason, then head over to squarespace.com/Drakenfell. You can get a free trial, and once you're ready, that little link will give you 10% off your first website or domain. So thanks once again to Squarespace for sponsoring the video, and on with the main show. Hello everybody, and welcome to a slightly different format video. You might be wondering where we are and who we are. Well, hopefully, if you're watching the channel, you already know who I am. I am, of course, Drak, or Drakenfell, but I have with me today a guest, so hello, guest.
Hello, thank you very much for having me on. My name is Paul Leyland. I'm mostly a strategy consultant, but I occasionally moonlight as a historian, and I'm here to talk about how the Spanish Armada was defeated on land 3 years before it sailed.
Excellent. And, well, if that hasn't got you interested, well, what are you doing watching the channel anyway? So, as you might guess from what's behind us, we are in a museum. We're in the National Maritime Museum in Greenwich, specifically in Queen's House in the Armada Room. So if you do get the chance, obviously please do come and visit, because these are historic paintings. A lot of the images you might be seeing coming up in the video will be digital copies of some of the paintings that are here in their original form. So you've probably at this point all seen the painting of the Battle of Gravelines or Gravelines, or however it's pronounced in French. Really high resolution photos around, but the original is literally right behind us and has so much more detail than any digital picture will ever give you. So definitely come and visit the National Maritime Museum and give them your support. Now that we know that it's about the Armada, we're in front of, well, one of 3 copies of the Armada painting. I guess a little bit of background to what we're going to be talking about, which is to do with the Netherlands. So why is the Armada coming to England? What's this got to do with the Netherlands? Why are the Dutch fighting the Spanish? And what's that got to do with, at the time, the English?
Sure. So this is a really convoluted and complicated story, which I'll try to distill into a few minutes. So initially, the English plan was not to stop the Spanish, it was to stop the French. The Queen Elizabeth escalated the Dutch revolt by helping Philip II of Spain. Essentially what happened in 1566, there was widespread revolt in the Netherlands. Philip II sent his favourite general, the Duke of Alva, who was a viciously effective commander, and he'd largely driven the revolt to the coasts, which the Netherlands, being full of polder, are quite defensible. And a number of the rebels effectively became politically motivated pirates. They were given letters of marque by William of Orange, and therefore they sought diplomatic sanctuary in the ports of England, which Philip II found very frustrating. And in February 1572, his temper was finally frayed, and a very strong diplomatic note was sent to the English government that said, you're going to have to do something about this. These are pirates, and they are attacking Spanish possessions in the Netherlands. So Elizabeth did what she felt was right and banished them from English ports. So it was absolutely to maintain good relations with the Spanish. And quite by coincidence, the Duke of Alba had sent the garrison of Brill, which is a Dutch port on the Scheldt estuary, to put down another bit of a revolt in Utrecht. And so the sea beggars were able to occupy Brill in March, and then things happened really quickly. So there were a number of strongly motivated Calvinists in England who volunteered to go and help the Dutch at this point, because the island of Walcheren, which becomes key to this story, also revolted. And the Huguenots, who were French Calvinists, joined in and became a very large force helping the sea beggars. And suddenly, from being a failed rebellion that was largely driven into the sea, there was a chance for the Dutch to fight for their freedom again, and Belgium as well. So there was then a really big problem, because the French were considering sending an army of 6,000 men to support the rebels as well. And so suddenly, in June 1572, it looked as though the French may take over the Netherlands. And so a memorial was produced, a memo, a government memo was produced, and I'll read the key sentence because it's quite punchy. If the French proceed to seek the maritime coasts of the Low Countries, it were good that the Duke of Alba were informed secretly of the Queen's disposition to assist the King, his master, by all honourable means, I'm not sure they meant that, in the defence of his inheritance. So this is key to the entire Armada narrative, and particularly up to 1585. English policy never changed, although the strategy went all over the place. English policy was to continue an interminable war in the Netherlands, to ensure that nobody was in charge, to ensure that nobody was going to be able to generate a sufficient maritime force to threaten England from the Scheldt. The only group of people that looked like they might be able to do that in the early 1570s was the French. And so English policy was to keep France out of the Netherlands, and so start using the base on Walcheren as a means of doing that, but also cooperate with the Spanish if needs be. Now then tragedy struck for France. In September 1572, the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre occurred, and in the ensuing civil war and violence, around 10,000 Huguenots were killed. So very suddenly, England's core problem of lots of Huguenot soldiers on Walcheren, which was strategically important to England, was solved, because they all went home to defend their families. And France was unable to send a royal army into the Netherlands because it was fighting a civil war. So suddenly, by a combination of the judgment of saying we need to be able to do something to keep the Netherlands confused, and the good luck of France being unable to do anything, meant that a volunteer English army was in control of Walcheren by the end of 1572, other than the fortress of Middelburg, the capital, which fell in 1574. So a comedy of errors, if you will, led England to control Walcheren early on in the Dutch revolt.
Right, okay, so that explains what everyone's doing up to this point. So the Spanish aren't particularly happy with the English, the French aren't particularly happy with the English, no one's particularly happy with the English, but that's how the English like it, as you mentioned. It's very yes Prime Minister, isn't it?
Yes.
You side with whoever's the losing side against the strong side, and then when they become the winning side, you side with the loser, just to keep everyone on their toes. So we then come to the point of Antwerp. Mm-hmm. So what happens with Antwerp?
So Antwerp had always been a very important port. It's by the mid-16th century, it was the largest port in the world. And a couple of things had driven that. The first was that it had become the main hub of the English wool trade. But just as importantly for the Spanish Armada story, because as I'm sure most of your listeners know, it was a Spanish-Portuguese fleet, and the Portuguese fleet was the key.
Yeah.
From the beginning of the 16th century, Antwerp was the main hub of the Portuguese spice trade, because it was a big deep water port, and suddenly you had big deep water ocean-going vessels rather than just coastal traffic in the wool trade that needed to come into a large port in the Netherlands. So Antwerp was the financial hub of Northern Europe. It was a massive port that was handling roughly 2,500 ships a week. I mean, that's a phenomenally high figure. There's a reason why even now Antwerp is the second largest port in Europe. Rotterdam's the largest, that's next door. Back at this time, Rotterdam was a tiny, tiny village. So by about 1550, Antwerp had a population of around 100,000 people. So it was about as big as London. It had a seafaring population of around 15,000 people. So it didn't take any imagination in England to realise that Antwerp was where any powerful force coming to invade England was going to come from. But Antwerp has an Achilles heel, and that is that it's 30-odd miles down the Scheldt estuary, and in order to get to Antwerp, you have to sail right past Walcheren Island. So if you hold Walcheren, you block Antwerp. So Antwerp has an extraordinary capacity to cause trouble for England, but also England has the ability to block up Antwerp. And again, if your listeners are familiar with the Napoleonic Wars, the 1809 Walcheren expedition was designed to do that, but it failed miserably. And interestingly, the reason why it failed was because of the lack of provisions. And even in September 1572, if you mind if I read again, Lord Burleigh, the head of the government, was informed of this. So Sir Humphrey Gilbert, who was one of the main volunteer commanders, wrote, "Her Majesty may have, at this present, the islands of Walcheren, Zierikzee and South Beverland, which are all of great wealth and lie together. They have out of them 80 sail of men of war, such as they be. They are not very well victualled," which is always the problem with Walcheren, as you probably know. But if they had Tolen, which is a nearby hinterland, then these three islands are able to victual 20,000 men continually. So by September 1572, not only was there a policy in place to deal with a great power taking over the maritime capacity of the Netherlands, there was also a strategic plan to put troops there, albeit it was a bit flaky because they were volunteers, and an operational understanding that those troops could only be there if they had provisions from the mainland. So lots of things fell into place that were not there in 1809.
Yeah, and this sort of the strategy of having something, whether it be an island or something else, that dominates what would otherwise be a critical seaway is absolutely key throughout maritime history. I mean, Gibraltar's an obvious one, although it's not an island, but it guards the straits, the entrance to the Mediterranean, so if you control that, you control basically anything that comes to and from, hence why Britain took it from the Spanish and never gave it back. Heligoland is another one. The British took it off of, ostensibly at the time, the Denmark in the Napoleonic Wars, and it ended up back in German control in 1890, but only because the newly formed German Empire took one look at Heligoland and went, it's sitting right outside the Kiel Canal and not too far from Wilhelmshaven. If we have a foreign power there, our naval dreams are basically dead on arrival. So they traded Zanzibar, of all places,
Indeed.
for it. And even when the Royal Navy was mostly based in the Thames, again, there's no real sort of major island sitting in the Thames estuary, but we do have Chatham and the Medway, which is obviously where the Royal Navy then based itself, mostly to good effect, although the Dutch gave us a few bruises on that one a little bit after the Armada. So, yeah, it's vitally important to always remember that just because you control a port, and of course the Spanish do occupy Antwerp, if you can't get out because someone dominates the sea passages there, it's effectively useless.
Yeah.
It's a big bill.
And there's a wonderful direct lineage to Heligoland as well, because the guy who gave up Heligoland was Lord Salisbury, who was a direct descendant of Lord Burleigh. And interestingly, Lord Burleigh also didn't have a full and complete understanding of maritime strategy. It was Francis Walsingham who largely did. But it's quite interesting that Lord Salisbury effectively handed the North Sea to Germany and started the end of the British Empire because of it.
So one of the key things to remember at this point is that, as we talked about earlier, the French were for a very long time before thought of as the main threat to invading England. But one of the critical issues is that although France is very close to England geographically, all of the major French ports at the time that could be used lie somewhere adjacent to what you might call roughly the middle part of the English south coast. Or in the case of Brest, it's on the Atlantic coast, but it's miles away relative to the nearer ports. What this means is that if you have any kind of wind that's going to drive the French fleet to the English shore, and bearing in mind that obviously we're talking about the age of sail, then an English fleet based somewhere along the Channel or maybe on the Medway can intercept it. So if the wind's coming from, let's say, the east, you can get ships coming from the Medway, maybe ships coming from Dover. If the wind's coming from the west, you can get ships coming from Plymouth, coming maybe from Portsmouth, if the invasion fleet's coming from Calais. So there's always a way to defend If there's a really, really strong breeze coming straight from the south, you have a few more problems, but that also limits the directions that the French can come, so you know where to defend. The problem with Antwerp is that Antwerp is right to the east of England at the time, because this is before the Act of Union. If the wind then comes in from the east, driving west down the channel, that means that every single English ship, whether they be in the Medway, Plymouth, Dover, Portsmouth, or wherever, is either pinned in port or can sail west. The invasion fleet that's coming from the east can also sail west, but obviously they will come in where the English fleet cannot physically get to, which makes the coast effectively undefended by ships, which is a major problem if you're an island and your main defence is a navy. Because let's face it, the English army at the time is not a professional army, it's not a standing army, and compared to the major land armies of Europe, it's not particularly large either. So we've got this volunteer force of English soldiers happily sitting basically at the mouth of the Scheldt. What turns this from a bunch of volunteers who are over there mainly because it's kind of in some ways an extension of the 30 Years' War and all the religious conflicts in Europe, over to British government policy of we are keeping this locked down?
Sure. So there's an awful lot of twists and turns here, largely relating to Queen Elizabeth dangling the carrot of marriage to Francois, Duc d'Anjou, who was second in line to the throne, brother of Henri III. And again, there's another comedy of errors that we don't need to go into. But essentially, in the summer of 1584, there is a huge crisis. So the Duc d'Anjou dies. And because he's dead, the heir to the throne of France is Henri de Navarre. He becomes the first Bourbon king of France, but right now he's a Protestant. So there's a civil war.
Yes.
Now that means that the French are not going to intervene to help the Dutch, and now the English security problem is flipped, because whereas before it was the French who were going to be the main threat, the Duke of Parma has proved to be a very effective commander, and he's dominating in the Low Countries. And crucially, in 1580 to 1583, Spain takes on Portugal, which gives Spain a deep sea fleet and a much better port, an Atlantic port in Lisbon. So suddenly Spain, not France, is the really scary power. So France is taken out of the picture. And critically also, at exactly the same time, Antwerp is besieged. Now, Antwerp has got about 80,000 people in it. Citizens' militias back then were like conscript armies, so Antwerp could put about 8,000 men into its defense. It was an extraordinarily well-defended city because it had been sacked previously. And initially there was a hope that Antwerp might hold, and it did hold for a year. But it became increasingly clear that Parma had the ability to take it. He even built a 700-meter bridge across the Scheldt, had the benefit of holding both sides, that he put guns on to prevent supplies getting through. And Antwerp was literally starving to death. By the time the siege ended, the population had halved. Now, some of them had escaped, but a lot of them had died. So in October 1584, Elizabeth was forced to bite the bullet and do what she absolutely didn't want to do, and call Parliament and say, we got effectively a war on our hands, because she needed taxes. Only way to fund a non-volunteer English military commitment was to raise taxes, which is exactly what happened. And immediately there was an idea of Francis Walsingham that looks like it first materialized in July 1578, was to take 3 towns. They're known as the cautionary towns, and Francis Walsingham rather cleverly persuaded Elizabeth that if we hold these towns, the Dutch won't be naughty and won't fail to repay their debts. We'll have something that they need, which was kind of true. They bought them back from James I. But what he really meant, and you could tell this from his correspondence with Lord Burleigh, was if they hold Brill, which is the northern deep sea port that you could potentially launch an invasion from, and also it's sufficiently far away from the main Belgian action that you can supply Walcheren. So it's offensive, defensive. And Vlissingen, Flushing, which is the main deep sea port that you would launch an invasion from if you couldn't use Walcheren, which is what Parma wanted to do. And it was also the place where they would invade if you sent the Armada to take Walcheren, so you need to hold Vlissingen. And critically, Fort Rammekens, which was the first major coastal sea fort in Europe designed for riverine, estuarine sea control. So there was an agreement that 6,000 men would be paid for by Parliament and stationed there. The citizens of Zeeland, they'd been trying to get Queen Elizabeth to become their queen for quite a while. They were pretty discomforted at the idea that England was going to take control without sovereignty, without representation. But by July 1585, it was fairly obvious that Antwerp was going to fall. And that put the citizens of Zeeland and England into a problem, because Flanders, which is pretty much a separate country almost, would have wanted Zeeland to lose. Because if Zeeland is continuing to fight, but Antwerp is part of effectively the Burgundian Spanish Empire, then Antwerp can't trade. And this is why it was vital that English troops took Walcheren formally, because otherwise it was very likely that there would be a stitch-up deal to allow trade to happen again, because this is what was making the Low Countries so wealthy. And one of the things that is really remarkable from what happens afterwards is that the Netherlands becomes really, really rich, and Belgium becomes relatively poor. And that's entirely because of the block-up of Antwerp, because it's still controlled by the Dutch. So the English agree the Treaty of Nonsuch, and by August 1585 there are 4,000 troops, officially English, stationed on Walcheren, ensuring that it can't be taken by sea and it can't be taken by land. So the fall of Antwerp, the collapse of France into civil war, and the knowledge that there is a real risk that the Dutch will be persuaded to give up Walcheren, if it's only volunteers on it, to make money again, all coalesced to force a rapid response.
Yeah, okay. And then, of course, we get the Armada comes along a few years later, and as you mentioned earlier, it's very important to note that although it's the Spanish Armada, because it's launched on the orders of Philip of Spain, it is made up of a lot of different ships from a lot of different places Spain has taken over. So the majority of its fighting power comes from the Portuguese. And people might be surprised, thinking, well, hang on, Spanish galleons, we've all heard of those. Well, yes, but a lot of the Spanish galleons you've heard of are ex-Portuguese galleons. But also even before the Spanish took over Portugal, yes, they did have a lot of galleons and other ships cruising around in the Atlantic. But a large majority of them were concerned mostly with maintaining the ongoing pillaging of South and Central America. The majority of Spanish fighting power during a lot of the period when Spain was the preeminent power was concentrated in the Mediterranean to fight the Ottomans. And a lot of that looked very different from the fleet that would come up the English Channel as the Spanish Armada. Lots of galleys, lots of galleasses, absolutely fantastic for fighting in the relatively confined and usually calm waters of the Mediterranean, practically useless for oceanic warfare. Initially, the Spanish order of battle did include lots of their galleys, and then they realized this was a really terrible idea, and even the number of galleasses got cut down. Eventually, they sent 4. They didn't do particularly brilliantly, which most people could have told you was going to happen anyway. But inevitably, you get the Armada coming up with its mostly Portuguese heavy fighting power, Spanish transports, some Spanish galleons, and various other ships they've managed to acquire, beg, borrow, or steal. So what could have happened if the Spanish had not just control of Antwerp, but control of the Scheldt? If they got there first, or they'd somehow other dissuaded the British from being there?
What the Spanish needed were frigates. But they didn't invent frigates until the 17th century for precisely the reason that we can go into now, because what the admiralties of Holland and Zeeland had were a lot of little ships, shallow draft, that if a great ship was caught on its own, would be taken out. And that had happened quite often with the Portuguese spice galleys. It had happened quite often with Spanish reinforcements that were coming through. So immediately the Spanish Armada broke up out of its defensive formation near the coast. It could be picked off by principally Dutch ships. Now, if the Scheldt were open, it's a big enough river channel for the Spanish Armada to sail in defensive formations. And so if Walcheren were unoccupied or occupied by Spanish troops, then the Armada could get into Antwerp, Parma's army could be embarked, and then, as you mentioned with the wind, they simply have to wait for the right wind. And the right wind for them is 3 things that doesn't happen in France. First of all, it is a wind that they can leave the Scheldt, westly. It is a wind that takes them to England, and it is a wind that prevents the English fleet from attacking. So Antwerp's got everything you need. The other key thing about Antwerp is it's effectively on a Rhine estuary, and so everything an army could need, everything that ships could need, from Switzerland to the sea, can be provided. So you just have to wait for the right time. And as we know from the real history of the Armada, which this painting wonderfully, honestly shows, is that the English fleet don't have an answer to a Spanish-Portuguese fleet in formation. So that's the key to Antwerp. That's the key to the Scheldt.
Yeah.
They come out in formation, nothing stops them. And critically, which I'm sure we'll come on to, they can invade north of the Thames, which is another. If you invade south of the Thames, you haven't invaded England. You've invaded Kent. And that's importantly different.
Yeah, and I think this is one of the things that's always very important to bear in mind, is because when you get to the end of the historical Armada campaign, when the English fleet is sitting in the North Sea waiting to see if the Spanish are going to loop back from what turns out to be a loop around Scotland and Ireland, a lot of the English fleet is decimated by disease, which tends to happen in those days if a fleet stays out at sea too long. If the Armada goes into Antwerp, loads up with men, as you said, they've got all the supplies they could possibly want. They can stay there practically indefinitely, waiting for the wind to change. And if the wind changes early, fantastic, the English fleet gets blown back, the Armada can sail. But even if they don't get a westerly for months, they can just sit there. The English fleet, if it sits outside, will eventually weaken and succumb to disease, at which point even a moderately favourable wind is fine for them. So it's an absolutely hugely important what if, but of course, thanks to the occupation of Walcheren, that doesn't happen. So what happens to Parma's army? Because obviously he can't load onto the Armada in Antwerp, he's got to load somewhere, so where does he end up going?
So he prefigures 1940 without the little ships. He turns up to Dunkirk, where his army is largely decimated by disease as well, because you can't get the provisions. It's the countryside and marshland polder. And essentially the problem with the entire Belgian coast from Dunkirk up to Ostend and the Scheldt estuary is that it is shallow, it is full of sandbanks, and the Armada just can't get close. You've also got the problem with the wind, that the Protestant wind is the sou'wester. As soon as which the fire ships did, as soon as you sort of pop through the cork of the channel, you're up into the North Sea, and you're just blown upwards. And the Spanish Armada couldn't beat back to Dunkirk, and so they had no chance of linking up. But the coastal sea control of the Dutch Navy was vital here, because it meant that even though there was only maybe a kilometre between the Spanish Armada and Parma's army, they had no way on earth of crossing that kilometre except in barges. And those barges would have been decimated by flyboats and small Dutch craft, as well as the English Navy, which was loitering about. So Parma could not put to sea, because the other critical element of the English defensive plan, which was provided by the Dutch, was they had almost perfect intelligence. Because you can't load an army onto barges; it takes about 72 hours. And you can't do it in secret. You can't hide it because it's on the beach, which means that all of the Dutch ships that are sitting off the coast are watching exactly what you do. You know exactly what's going to happen. And so even if they were lucky enough to potentially have got across, they would have been intercepted.
Yeah.
So Dunkirk is not possible because of the Dutch Navy. But even if it were possible, Parma wouldn't want to end up in Margate.
Yeah, right. So you mentioned you mentioned Parma doesn't want to end up in Margate, and you mentioned a bit earlier about invading Kent. So what is so critical about not landing on the south coast? Because we've seen Napoleon's invasion plans, Hitler's invasion plans. Not only do they have this same problem of, yes, you can cross the channel in small boats as long as there's absolutely nobody to oppose you, but they rely on landing on the south coast. But as you said, that's probably not the best idea, so why?
So 1066 and all that, people tend to stop the story with the arrow in the eye. And to be fair, once you've killed the king, William's got an awful lot going for him. So after Hastings, William marches up to what he thinks is London.
Sorry.
And what William the Conqueror actually does is he marches to Suffolk, and he sees the Thames, and on the other side of the Thames. And so he gets across and he burns Suffolk, which doesn't achieve very much. And then he marches to Oxfordshire, 100 miles, 100 kilometres. And he manages to bribe an earl to keep a bridge open so he can cross the Thames, so he can eventually invade London. Now, this is a time when a lot of people in England think that William has probably got a reasonable chance of being the legitimate king, and he's killed the actual king, and has destroyed England's main field army, and the government's paralysed. So in 1066, you're able to march from Hastings to Southwark, to Oxfordshire, and back to London, relatively unopposed. That is not the situation that Parma would have faced. Similarly, 100 years later in 1688, what is not fully factored in with what is a successful invasion, 20-odd thousand men, including 50, an army of about 14,000, left the Scheldt to invade England, but they didn't land in Kent. They didn't land north of the Thames because it was too obvious, and that's what James would have expected. They landed in Tor Bay in Devon to be prepared to march all the way across the Salisbury Plain to get to the other side of the Thames and then to be able to attack London. So successful invasions of England have either been, the king has been dumb enough to fight them on the beaches and lose, or William of Orange, William III, worked out the problem and so took a massive flanking manoeuvre all the way to Devon to march back up to London. So if you and to be fair to the English army at the time, it wasn't as bad as people thought. You could raise a sort of a subject militia of around 50,000. It's not good enough to take on Parma's army, but it is good enough to ruin a supply chain. And the great thing about English maritime logistics is that you could pull the 6,000 men on Walcheren to join the army in Tilbury faster than Parma could march anywhere. And because he'd arrived in barges, he didn't have sea control for any supplies or logistics. So he's doomed.
Yeah.
He's doomed. One of the sad things about the English narrative of invasion being really scary is that no one, and luckily for the troops involved, no one's been dumb enough to attempt an military invasion by barge. And so we haven't realised just how tragic that would have been for the people involved. And it continues to be a bogeyman to this day. But Parma had, even if there was no Dutch fleet bottling him up in Dunkirk, Parma would have been lucky to get his barges across if a sou'wester blew and send them all to the North Sea or to the bottom of the sea. And even if he did land troops in Margate, they couldn't have done anything of any use.
And I think this is another key thing that people sometimes don't appreciate is that, if you look on Google Maps, satellite view or something, the south of England looks relatively flat, relatively easy to conquer, assuming you can get off the beaches, because a lot of the cliffs are not particularly forgiving. But when you look at, say, the defensive plans that were in place for World War II, you actually notice there are some rather nasty terrain features. You've got the South Downs, which are pretty steep. I mean, theoretically, if you can occupy Portsmouth, landing is easy enough if you know the channel and if you can defeat the Royal Navy, which, okay, those are fairly big asks, but Portsmouth itself, relatively flat, relatively easy to occupy. There's a socking great ridge right behind it, which is a perfect way to just bottle up any occupiers. And most of the rest of the South Downs are like that. Assuming you can get past that, and there are a few passes through there, you then come to the other set of downs, Epsom Downs and so forth around London, which are similar terrain. World War II plans basically pointed out that if you're an offensive attacking tank force, there's about 4 places you can come through, and they're very easy to predict. Which is, for those of you who are in the UK, that's basically where the M23 joins the M25, where the A3 joins the M25, basically where the roads join around the M25, because that's why they're there in the first place.
Yes.
And then, as you mentioned, especially back in those days, the vast majority of London, whereas these days, to be honest, London by square mileage is actually more south of the river than north, but back in those days, almost all of London is north of the river. City of London is, the docks are, you've got Southwark and Bermondsey and Greenwich where we are now, places like that, but they're, for the most part, almost independent towns, and Southwark is just kind of the ancillary of London where they stick all the stuff they don't actually want in London, like tanneries and bathhouses. So it's not a particularly great loss if someone burns Southwark down. It's a way of signalling that you're angry with London, but that's about it. So if you want to knock out the economic heart of England, you have to get over the Thames, and that's a lot tougher job than it might seem these days, because of course nowadays you've got loads of bridges and tunnels. Well, back then you'd have London Bridge, which is fairly easy to close off or destroy. And these days you've got embankment and various other features of London that have narrowed the Thames. The Thames back then was a lot wider and a lot more difficult to cross. So it's a huge barrier to a successful invasion, assuming that the people of England at the time are willing to resist, which, not to put too fine a point on it, but given that at the time most of England was ostensibly in the eyes of most of Europe a bunch of heretics who would probably be burned at the stake if the Spanish did take over, they had a little bit more of a stake in this than just nationalism.
Yes.
So we've got Palmer stuck in Dunkirk. He's got Dutch flyboats which are preventing him from linking up with the Armada. We've got the English fleet kind of harassing the Armada as it goes along. But then we have this kind of break point eventually where the Armada is scattered and it ends up being sent off. So how does this all come together? We've got Antwerp basically locked out. We've got Palmer kept in place. What stops the Spanish from just sitting waiting for an opportunity where the Dutch get bored and go away, or someone baits the Dutch out to fight them, or something like that? So at this crucial point, how does the Armada lose, albeit now the deck's stacked against them?
The Protestant wind. And that's precisely the point. There's this wonderful, honest portrait that does not show an English fleet engaging a Spanish fleet other than with fireships. Because for 2 or 3 days, the Spanish-Portuguese fleet regained battle order, tried to beat back into the Channel North Sea junction and tried to give battle to the English fleet. But the winds were against them. And it's important to stress as well that there is no doubt that English ships, or a critical mass of English ships, had some important advantages over Spanish and Portuguese ships. And one of the biggest was they were considerably more handy. They could sail much closer to the wind because they were basically commerce raiders. It was, dare I say it, this might annoy many of your listeners, it was like sending battle cruisers into battleships. You don't, depending on which battle cruisers. I know that's a dangerous thing. Probably want to edit that out.
It's fine. People will argue that's to the death of the sun.
The very early battle cruisers, they could not engage closely enough. You could only destroy. The better example is 1592, on the other side of the world. If you want to know how to take down an invasion fleet of great ships, look at what the Koreans did with turtle ships. That's what's needed. England didn't have anything like that. So essentially, the main reason why the Spanish-Portuguese fleet had to give up was because the wind blew and they only had about a month's worth of provisions left on their ships. And you need about that to get back to Lisbon and back to the Spanish coast. So basically the invasion timed out because of the logistical requirements of feeding your men for the return voyage, because there was nowhere to go.
Yeah, and then of course, obviously, as you mentioned, the English keep hold of the mouth of the Scheldt estuary for a little while longer, presumably and mostly out of paranoia, just because it's not the last Spanish Armada.
No, indeed.
There's quite a few. I mean, there's the English Armada, which doesn't end particularly well either, but a succession of increasingly desperate and increasingly terrible failures when other Spanish armadas come along, which again is another part of the whole story that doesn't often get told. But of course, for those of you who love your ships out there, the Armada is a critical turning point in, at the time, England's outlook on the world, and particularly on the Navy's outlook on what its role is and how it's to be utilised in the future. And you can see this in a number of elements. If you look at Royal Navy battle honours, the very first battle honour is the Armada. The Royal Navy, depending on who you ask, has either been in existence since Henry VIII or Alfred the Great, either of, but they have fought multiple battles. Battle of the Solent, where the Mary Rose was lost, for example, before this, but none of those are recorded. The Armada starts the battle honours system. And also, if you look at the listings of the English ships, you'll see a lot of very, very, very familiar names. Now, some of them, where they were just named after their owners or whatever, obviously have gone by the wayside. But if you think of ships like Revenge, Victory, Ark Royal, Swiftsure, Dreadnought, all of these and more are all there at the Armada. And they're not all royal ships. Some of them are, but a lot of them are privately owned. But because of the exploits that they take part in during the Armada, those names embed themselves in the consciousness of the Royal Navy to the extent that they're constantly reused. And some of the ships whose names you see in the Armada list are in service under obviously new guises even today, and have been almost continuously ever since. So it's a hugely important element of English history, not just because the Spanish didn't manage to take over, but from the foundational, I guess, mythology, if you like, of the Royal Navy. But as we've been discussing, there's huge other elements involved in this. You've got the English army at the Scheldt, you've got the Dutch, who a few decades later we'd end up at war with, operating off of the coast. You've got the weather, which is a huge influencing factor for any kind of age of sail expedition. And it's important to remember all of these in combination, because any one of those, take away any one of those things, and there is going to be some kind of landing. Whether or not it succeeds, that's another matter for land-based historians to argue over. But you can't just emphasize any one element.
But I think, if I could say something relatively controversial, I think there's one thing that you can emphasize and needs to be emphasized, and that is that the key to defeating the Spanish Armada was what was essentially, could be termed a British expeditionary force, was a deployment of English troops on the key Belgian coast before trouble started. And the foundation myth of the Spanish Armada has persuaded a critical mass of decision makers in England and then Britain that they could rely on a blue water defense. The blue water narrative of the Spanish Armada is effectively a Spanish victory until it was too late for them to do anything. They could sail through the channel and hang around the Channel North Sea junction without the English ships being able to do anything about it. So there is I think, an enormous danger of the mistelling of the Spanish Armada has meant that after Walsingham's brilliant idea to formalize the occupation of Walcheren, English history, British history since then, has been responding to an army that's already taken Belgium, which is considerably more difficult to dislodge. And all of the great wars that Britain fought since have been primarily to dislodge armies from Belgium before they can develop maritime power. And if only they knew what Walsingham was up to, we might have had a better proactive policy and strategy before it all went wrong.
Yeah, and that's something that's, obviously discussed away in the comments, but it's certainly something that's worth considering, because if you look further down the line through various great admirals of the Royal Navy, Admiral Fisher, for example, famously said that the British Army is a projectile to be fired by the Royal Navy. He knew how important land troops were, he just didn't think that it was a particularly good idea to try and go man-to-man with a European army in straight-up field battle. He was talking about specific operations where the Navy would take the army to a place on land that needed to be occupied to keep the seas safe. And you see that throughout British strategy during the entire empire period. We already mentioned Gibraltar. Britain's not interested in taking the rest of Spain. Just have Gibraltar. Great, we've got the Mediterranean. They open the Suez Canal, we'll have Egypt. Everyone's going around to the spice trade, right, we'll take South Africa. Specifically Cape Town. They don't actually care that much about the rest of South Africa until the Boers start getting a bit annoying. Just Cape Town, because you then, small element of land controls the sea. And look across the rest of the world and you'll see this repeated time and time again. So in many ways you could say, for the smarter of the British tacticians who exercise these decisions to actually go and occupy these places, it probably all starts here with the people who are actually looking at and going, okay, yeah, we didn't lose at sea, but perhaps we actually won on land.
Exactly.
Well, there you go, everyone. Another new take on the Spanish Armada, and I think one that's definitely got a lot of legs to it. I'm looking forward to the absolute firestorm I'm sure there's going to be argued in the comments. But hey, that's what discussion is for. So thank you very much to Paul for coming and talking to us. And thank you very much to the National Maritime Museum and the Armada Room here in Queen's House in Greenwich. As I said before, please do come and visit it if you can. There's loads of excellent exhibits to visit, but obviously if you're particularly interested in the Armada, not only have you got this painting here, and as I mentioned before, the big battle painting behind us, you've also got portraits of the various major characters involved surrounding us. And there will be new and interesting exhibitions, because at the time that this is being filmed, Queen's House is actually closed because they're renovating it to put in new exhibits. So that will all be brand new. Even if you visited it before, there's something new to see. And by the time that this goes up, they'll be reopened and you can come and see all of that. So thanks very much for listening, everyone, and see you again in another video.